Do you want to create an exotic garden? Join me over the next 20 minutes as I show you how I transformed my plain lawn back garden into a tropical oasis. I'll be talking through my hard landscaping choices, my plants, the structures I put in the garden and how it all came together to turn quite a boring traditional back garden into a truly incredible exotic space that I can enjoy all year round. So the garden when we got it was pretty much a long lawn with hedging on the edges and an old fruit tree and plenty of silver birch trees and laurel bushes as well as a couple of dilapidated greenhouses at the end of the garden. Plot is long and narrow, so it's roughly 45-50 meters long and it's about 8 to 9 meters wide, and it's facing west northwest, so it's not full sun all day, but there is plenty of good growing conditions, or potentially lots of good growing conditions. And initially the first thing we did was to clear the space. So this meant cutting down all the silver birch trees, many of which were rotten through for some reason, and we also took down an old willow tree and an apple tree and 2 big laurel bushes, and I had a good go at taking down all this foliage, and it meant there was a lot there to actually get rid of, a lot of green waste, branches and trunks as well. And underneath one of the big laurel bushes we found an old patio which was completely covered, and where obviously all the big shrubs and trees were, there was no grass or anything under them. It was just basically barren soil and rubble. And once we took down some of the trees, we also found the fence was very dilapidated, needed replacing on one side. On the other side we had the longest, biggest conifer hedge imaginable. It was a good sort of 2 meters or 8 foot wide, 45-50 meters or 150 foot long, so a big old hedge. And at the end of the garden it basically opened up into open countryside, into open fields. There was nothing really between the end of the garden, the fields, the cows, everything that was in those fields. There were 2 old greenhouses. In one of them, obviously not being used for many years, as it was full of 70s and 80s gardening magazines and catalogues. There were still tomatoes in the other ones that must have been used by the previous owners, and an old shed with a church pew in it. And there was a lot of rubbish. So basically year 1 was clearing everything, getting rid of all the rubbish, all the rubble, and it was a long way from the back of the garden to the front of the house. It was lots of trips in the wheelbarrow. And once everything was cleared, I could really get a good idea of where the space would take me in terms of being able to plan it out and thinking what I wanted to plant where. And I wanted to get the hardy backbone in as soon as possible. And the main big plant I wanted to get in straight away was my big Jubea chilensis, because that was a big plant and I wanted it to have, a really good root run. I wanted to get into ground as soon as possible to give it the biggest chance of getting off to growth as soon as possible. But I had to actually get all the plants from my old house and bring them here. So we hired a little truck and we did several trips to move all the plants that were all in pots that I've been potting up over the last few years from my old house to bring it to this house. So the big Jubea was the biggest plant, but there's lots of other palm trees, bananas and yuccas and things like that. Now, the conifer hedge is a shared hedge, so I couldn't cut it all down, but I could cut it back quite a long way. So one drizzly day or evening even, I saw about taking down many of the branches, cutting back by half. So rather than being 8 foot wide, it was a more respectable sort of 4 or 5 foot wide. And then we put up a fence on that side, so we had a nice clean edge to work with. And many of the plants, because when we moved it was winter, had to be brought into the house. So we had all my tender plants into the house or into the garage at that time, and only the hardy plants were kept outside, including all my tree ferns that I moved. One of the first jobs was also checking what the soil was like, because I had no idea really what the soil conditions were going to be like. I did a pH test and found there was actually on the alkaline side, and I did a pit down to about 60-70 centimetres, so over 2 foot deep. And after the first 6 to 8 inches of very heavy clay soil, we got into pure clay, nothing but building clay. And the water table was very, very high, so the water just stayed at the level you can see in the picture all the time, didn't lower at all. That's where the water basically stays, and that's, you know, what we had to deal with. So I knew to be able to grow a big range of plants, palm trees, bamboos and arid plants, I would have to really increase the drainage and also raise the level of the soil across pretty much all the garden. And I thought the best way of doing this would be to have raised planters basically. So the first plant, like I said, was the Jubea that we planted in the centre of the garden, and I drew a plan of where I wanted everything to be, measured it out to scale, and I knew the Jubea had to be in the centre, and that was the first plant that went in the first summer after moving in the spring. And I built a wooden raised bed around it, improved the soil and added grit underneath the palm tree, and then basically laid it on the surface of where the lawn was, and then filled soil all around it so that it was nice and raised and lots of nutrition for the roots to go sideways into that. And I also planted some aeoniums and other plants around it as well, including some small princeps palms that you'll see in later in this video that had to move because they get too big after they've been in for a few years. Even though Jubea was the biggest plant and it's, you know, it is huge now, when I planted it, it didn't actually look that large, and it's grown a lot over the last 10 years. And again, you'll see that later in the video. So this is a view of the second half of the garden. You can still see it's very open indeed. So the winds come through, especially in winter, off the hills, off the fields there, straight into the garden. So creating windbreaks was essential. So the back of the garden was planted up with hedging plants, hawthorn hedging plants, and eucalyptus trees were planted, very, very small saplings, and allowed one of the big laurel bushes in the corner to grow large as well to act as a windbreak. And the right hand side fence went up, but we still kept the conifer hedge behind, and on the left hand side I started planting some small hedging plants. And I knew the easiest way to make a good raised bed was to do geometric shapes. So we did squares and triangle beds. And in between those beds, I actually put sleepers and put decking over the edges so that we had somewhere to walk on. So basically raise the level by about 25-30 centimetres right across the second half of the garden. Many of the plants, including big bamboos, were in big pots and had to be brought right down the garden, and I placed most of these roughly in the areas where they were going to be planted, because as soon as I got my decking and all the sleepers in place, it would have been much harder to move these big pots. Here you can see how that worked in terms of having the sleepers. I put plastic on the inner side to keep the moisture in the beds and to prevent them from rotting really quickly. I put gravel and channels inside between the sleepers to allow water to drain off to really increase the drainage, and then we put the decking on top of the sleepers to make some quite narrow paths. And to actually fill these paths and to fill these beds, it took a lot of soil, grit, manure, literally tons and tons of the stuff, and there were many deliveries of these big bulk bags that had to then unload and put in a wheelbarrow and do thousands of trips back and forth down the garden to raise the levels. And this is a view after the first summer. So this is where we got to in year one, where I've got the raised beds and I've managed to fill 2 of them. So we've got the Jubea in the centre and then a tropical bed full of colour of dahlias, bananas, and also the cannas as well. and you can see the new fence on one side, and on the other side you can see where we've still got a bit of conifer and still got plenty of planting to do to make a hedge on that side as well. And then the following year we filled up the rest of the beds in the second half of the garden and planted out lots of tropical plants. So we've got the pink chinas, got the gingers, we've also got in the middle, got astelias, more aeoniums in the gravel beds, got some agaves, Chemops humilis, we've got all sorts of plants here. And this is a view, it's still looking pretty open, but now it's well planted with lots of interesting plants for this second half of the garden in year 2. And one thing I wanted to do was to, instead of having a small greenhouse in the garden, I wanted to convert the garage into a grow space because it was a big space that we're never going to park the car in. So we thought, let's convert it into a greenhouse. So I went about doing that. I tiled the floor, so I've got some nice tiles in there. I painted the walls white to reflect the light, make it nice, light and airy. And I put double glazing patio doors in, and I did a polycarbonate roof as well to allow lots of lighting. Took off the old tiles, completely transformed the space, which was great for growing plants that I'll continue to use forever. One of the big features I wanted in the garden was a pond, and not just a round pond. I wanted a pond that basically looked like a stream that you had to cross over, and it looked like basically a stream running across the garden. So I dug this out, and this was a lot of digging to make this long, narrow pond. And I built a waterfall on one side. So it had a pump in the center that went through a pipe round under the soil, uphill a little bit, built up with rocks that I found around the garden, as well as buying some big boulders that I had to move down, and had the waterfall pumping, flowing into the pond and then recirculating that way. And obviously to get across the pond, I had to build a bridge. So I did a nice decking bridge as well to get across to the second half of the garden. Another feature I really wanted in the garden was a nice place to sit, and I wanted something in keeping with the exotic vibes without being too over the top. So I went for a jungle style pavilion or hut that I built. It was basically hexagonal, nice posts, and then we had a thatched roof put on top. This is what it looks like when it was finished. Still, as you can see, with lawn around it, because it was the second half of the garden that I did first before moving on to the first half of the garden. Another feature I wanted was an archway to frame the view going down the second half of the garden, and this was basically a wooden archway which was quickly covered in years 3 and 4 by the chocolate vine and also the passion vines as well. They vigorous vines that covered that, and it looked really good for several years until last year when the winter storms brought down the archway, which revealed a very different view now that the rubella has grown up. So as well as getting some of these main plants in the first couple of years, I still had lots of planting to do, including nearer the back of the garage, which had some palm trees that I planted. I cleared an old lilac tree out, and I put loads of ferns in because it's quite a shady area here. So some tree ferns, some gingers, fatsias as well. So it's quite a shady area, and that basically has looked after itself for the last 10 years, and now it's a really nice green lush part of the garden. We did the bamboo hedge, so we split 3 or 4 bamboos that are grown in pots, and we planted them by the conifers in the shadier spot of the garden, and put lots of fatsias in front. Different types of fatsias, all different species and forms were planted down there. Now back to the end of the garden where the eucalyptus were planted as very small plants. They quickly shot up, then after just 1 or 2 years they were already over 6 foot tall, and I planted some other hedging plants down there as well, because I soon found out that cows will pretty much try eating everything. So they were eating the bamboos, eating fatsias, so hawthorn plants went in, which discouraged them because obviously they're quite thorny, but they will go for anything. Then I decided it was time, so the children grown up a little bit, to get rid of the lawn in the first half of the garden. So I laid out some logs to make a path with some quite acute angles, and I did a double row of these, and this meant I had some posts to support these, put some weed suppressor membrane down, and then put some wood chip and wood bark down to make a nice easy path. And it also raised up the level, so basically I was still, like the second half of the garden, raising the level by about 25 centimeters. So yet again I had to fill all these beds with more soil, more compost and more manure, because unlike the second half of the garden, which had a mixture of sort of exotic and arid planting, the first half of the garden I wanted to be more lush, so I wanted more tropical jungle style plants, lots of colour, so I wanted to add lots of manure and lots of compost to make it nice and nutrient rich and moisture retentive. So now that we've got the hard landscaping in place, we've got the major plants in place, we've got the stream going across the garden, the jungle hut, the raised beds, the eucalyptus trees. Now it's time to watch things grow. So over the next 5 or 6 years, everything got bigger and better. I've had to thin plants out, I've had to move a few plants, but that's gardening, and I've added lots of summer colour every single year just to make it different. So lots of annuals mixed in with the perennials and the shrubs and the major plants, and this means the garden has a distinct feel of the backbone plants, the exotic look, mixed in with ever-changing exotic flashes of colour throughout the summer and the autumn months. And the garden's never finished. I have recently gone about changing many of the paths, so we've gone from the wooden decking to gravel paths to go with the arid feel of the second part of the garden. I've got much more to do. So that's the first 10 years of my garden, really planning it out, thinking about the soil conditions, the growing conditions, and putting the right plant in the right place to thrive in my Yorkshire garden. Continue watching my videos, watching how I change the garden over the years, and you'll see the exotic garden change over the next 10 years plus into the future. Thank you for watching this edition of Exotic Gardening with me, Kris. Join me next week where we'll be doing more in the garden.